నమస్కారం. నా ఈ ప్రయత్నం మీకు నచ్చినట్లయితే గనక మన ఛానల్ని సబ్స్క్రైబ్ చేసుకొని పై జాబితాలోని మరిన్ని వీడియోలను చూడటం ద్వారా మీ నైపుణ్యాలను జ్ఞానాన్ని కూడా అభివృద్ధి చేసుకోవడానికి ప్రయత్నించండి. జై హింద్. Please like, share and subscribe for more videos. Thank you.
Our next protagonist is the first official World Chess Champion, Wilhelm Steinitz. He earned the title in 1886 by beating Johannes Zukertort in a match, but he was already considered a top player, potentially the best player, from the mid-19th century. What's interesting about his style is that he started out as an all-out attacking player, as it was common at the time, but then went on to change his approach toward chess and became very positional. Positional at the time was very shocking to the rest of the chess players, and they actually considered his new style of playing as cowardly and controversial. It was only later his successor on the world champion's throne, Emanuel Lasker, who acknowledged the influence and the impact of the concepts Steinitz introduced. These concepts include the accumulation of small advantages, structural advantages, the maneuvering for outposts, the bishop pair, the importance of open files, and mobility. We are going to take a look at one of his games from the 1873 Vienna tournament, but I do suggest that you actually find this event and check out more of his games, since it's very instructive to see how this new positional style appears in his play. The game starts with e4, e5 against Adolf Schwarz. It is Wilhelm Steinitz with the black pieces, and the opening is the Italian opening. Surprise, surprise. d3, knight f6, knight c3, d6, bishop g5, and here Steinitz goes for the approach that is h6, after bishop h4, g5, clearly suggesting that he has no intention or whatsoever of castling kingside, will castle queenside. Bishop to g3, and now a6. This is a very smart move order that we will understand after the next move of white. Queen to d2, and now bishop g4. Had he played bishop g4 a move earlier, bishop g4 could have been contested with h3, asking the bishop what does he want to do. And the capture on f3 doesn't lead to anything beneficial for black, since the queen can take back on f3. So bishop g4 makes a lot more sense once the queen has moved to d2. And this, in general, is a useful move for black, so that the bishop cannot be taken. Sometimes knight e4. Bishop g4 now, and white ignores the threat of bishop takes f3, since this is the 19th century, and there's nothing wrong about doubled pawns, right? He could have taken immediately on f3. He went for queen e7 first, and after h4, now he captures the knight. And so we will focus on this pawn structure and the weakness of this pawn chain. Doubled pawns, as we have mentioned in previous videos, they have pros and cons, but here it's more about the disadvantage of doubled pawns. Yes, white gains the g file, but that's not important in this position. What is really crucial is that these pawns become weak. Especially the f3 pawn is a target, and the f4 square is an outpost, a future outpost for black's pieces. Black castles queenside. There's no rush in attacking the f3 pawn or approaching it. You should first finish development. H takes g5, h takes, and of course this pawn is not hanging because the h1 rook is en prise. Therefore, if rook takes, it is still not possible to capture it because of rook h1 check, which led to white playing castle queenside, a natural developing move, just like black's one, and here knight h5. The maneuver begins. This knight is heading toward the f4 square. Remember that we mentioned it as a weak square, an outpost for black's pieces. But it's not only about jumping there immediately, it's also about vacating the f6 square for the queen, so that the f3 pawn becomes an immediate target. It is a very weak pawn. c3 was played by white to cover the d4 square. But after queen f6, it is already trouble. Big trouble. How do you defend the f3 pawn? There isn't really a good way to do that. Knight g1 is a really ugly move, and it doesn't help. We could simply take on g3. Now the rook is hanging on h1, so white has to take on h8 first. And now when he captures on g3, rook h1, and the position is about to collapse. We can take on g1, trade pieces so that the f3 pawn falls eventually. In the game, instead of knight g1, d4 was played, which is more active, trying to attack in the center. So it is of course a better try. Steinitz responded with knight takes g3, and it's very concrete now. If white takes back on g3 simply, f takes g3, the point is that we can take on h1, and then the capture on d4 is a lot stronger. The rook is not on d1 anymore, so this pawn is not protected. We can simply win the pawn. Easy. Therefore, after knight takes g3, white played rook takes h8. And here, if we take on h8 with the rook, now the same capture means that white is still protecting the d4 pawn. Very important difference. Therefore, after rook takes h8, Steinitz goes for knight takes e2 check first. Makes a lot of sense. And bishop takes e2, rook takes h8, d takes c5, d takes c5. If we count what has happened with all these trades, I know it was a little too fast, or maybe too slow depending on your level. But yeah, we end up having a pawn up as black. Let's just repeat this. So after all these trades, knight takes g3 and rook takes h8, knight takes e2 check, intermediate move, bishop takes e2, and now when we capture the rook, our bishop falls, so there's no piece up for black. But in the end, black is a pawn up, and this pawn is still weak, the structure is still bad. So yeah, we are already a pawn up, and white's pawn chain hasn't improved a single bit. There was one possible improvement for white in all this line. After knight takes e2 check, he could have taken with the queen on e2. And there's a very important difference if the queen and bishop are placed like this, that white actually, after d takes c5, has the possibility of giving a perpetual check. Perpetual check by sacrificing the bishop on a6, b takes a6, queen takes a6, and there's no mate with only one queen attacking, but there is perpetual check. There's no way to prevent it. Black cannot go to a8 in order to try to cover up with the knight on a7, because this is a pin on the 6th rank, the queen would be hanging. So this would have been a draw, but obviously it wasn't so clear to see that after queen takes e2, there's this perpetual check. It is the 19th century, and yeah, it's tactics, so maybe Mr. Adolf Schwartz could have seen it, but yeah, we all make mistakes, right? Bishop takes c2 was an inaccurate move, after which black has the pawn up that we mentioned and the better pawn structure. Let's see how the game went on, because it is still not so easy to convert in that, as we mentioned, this game is about accumulating small advantages. So black is a pawn up, but his pawn up is a doubled pawn. Yeah, there's also a doubled pawn here, but it's still far from being a winning position. Rook g1 attacking black's pawn. So what do? You don't just give back the pawn, right? Steinitz plays rook g8. Even if it looks passive, you need to hang on to that extra material and then improve your pieces. So a potential maneuver, can you find a potential maneuver for black to improve his knight? Please pause the video and answer this question now. Where do you think this knight could be very well placed, the c6 knight, in the next couple of moves? Well done! I hope that you have thought of the same as I did. Knight to d8, knight to e6, and then knight f4. As we mentioned, that is an outpost. Also, once the knight is on e6, our pawn will finally be protected. So the rook can be freed up and take one of the open files. So it is only a temporary passive move, rook to g8. In the future, there will be a much more active spot for the rook, simply by defending the pawn first, knight d8, knight e6, improving the knight and also taking care of this pawn on g5. King to c2, and there we go, knight d8. As announced, queen d5, attacking the c5 pawn. Queen e7 was played by black. And now rook d1. Knight e6 is still not possible because the e5 pawn is hanging, therefore black chases the queen away first. Because one thing is to improve our pieces and the other is to worsen the opponent's. Here we see both. Black is aiming to improve his pieces, now for instance the knight by maneuvering toward the f4 square, but he's also striving to make his opponent's pieces less active by pushing them back. c6, chasing the queen away from an important central square. Queen b3. And now look at this, following up with the idea of making the queen worse. b5. Wow, the king is on c8, and he's just pushing this pawn like there was nothing dangerous about it. And he's right, it's not dangerous, because there's no way of approaching the c8 king. And c4 is a big threat, threatening to attack the queen. The queen is running out of space, could only go to a3 or b4, and that leads to the trade of queens with a pawn down. That's pretty sad. So white had to push c4 to prevent black from advancing c4. But look at this, what happens after pushing c4? Let's just analyze the structure. New weaknesses appear. Every move has its consequences, and the consequence of c4 is that now the d4 and b4 squares are unprotected. We have a new outpost for the knight. Not only the f4 square, which is beautiful, but also the d4 square, which is even more beautiful and would win material. So let's go! Knight e6, heading toward the new weakness, d4. The king has to move because this fork would have been really painful. But we will still jump to d4 because that is a perfect spot for the knight. Queen e3, and now, well, we have placed the knight where we wanted. That is a beautiful piece. It's an outpost. It's called an outpost because white cannot chase that piece away. Both the c and e pawns have been advanced. He cannot push c3 nor e3. The only way to get rid of this knight would be by sacrificing his rook for it, because the bishop is in a different color. That's pretty bad once again. So yeah, we have the knight perfectly placed, but we should improve the rest of our pieces, accumulating advantages. Black is a pawn up, has a great outpost on d4. Let's further improve the position by activating the rook. Where shall it go? Rook to h8. And after queen d2, let's improve further. Rook to h2, attacking the f2 pawn. Bishop f4 was played. Very sad when you need to defend your pawns in this way. The queen is protecting a poor pawn on f2. The bishop is on the back rank. This position is lost for white, but we will still wait until the end so that we can learn even more, because the knight is well placed now. The rook is perfect on h2. The queen could still be improved by black, but first he takes care of the queen side, grabbing even more space. b4, grabbing the important c3 square, and just in general closing the queen side so that this bishop is passive forever. The c4 pawn is blocking the diagonal. So more space, control of these squares, and killing the f1 bishop forever. Queen e3, and now comes the queen. As we mentioned, that was the last piece to be improved by black. Now the position will be perfect. The pawn was hanging, of course, so rook d3 protects it for now. And here comes the final blow. You can pause the video and think, what would you play here? It's not something crazy, so don't calculate knight takes f3, please. But simply a way of opening up the position to take advantage of this bishop on f1. Pause it if you want to think more. And the move is g4. Sacrificing this pawn temporarily so that we can capture on f2 with the rook. Now look at these pieces. Compare the f2 rook and the f6 queen and how they collaborate to the e3 queen and the d3 rook. Horrible pieces. And please also compare the minor pieces on the board. The f1 bishop versus the d4 knight. This is called good knight, bad bishop. Here white resigned, but I will ask you in the exercises what would have happened after bishop h3. So make sure to calculate the final blow. Also read more about Steinitz's life, find out more about his writings, and how Winston Churchill mentions him in the biography Churchill wrote about his father. I will see you in the next video.